Mahadi, Africa. Welcome to Bite-Sized Democracy, a weekly show that focuses on issues around democracy in Africa. Our show gives you a snapshot of what's happening on the continent in fun, informative, bite-sized segments. Please do join us in conversation on #BSDemocracy and do subscribe to our YouTube channel, the African Democratic Institute. My co-host for today is Clemmy. Welcome back to the show, Clemmy.
Thanks for having me again.
On today's show, we'll be talking about terrorism in Africa. You know, a lot of terrorist activity happens in the Western world, like in Europe and in America, but there's also a lot of terrorist organizations here in Africa. So Clemmy, please do let us know, what is a terrorist group?
A terrorist can be, terrorism is actually not really well defined in the world today. There's no legal, widely shared definition for this terrorism. What we, however, agree on is that terrorism is the use of violence or threat of violence in order to perpetrate a political and ideological change, And it's always the actions by non-state actors, actually.
Okay. Oh wow, that's actually very interesting to know. And there's a few groups in Africa that have been classified as terrorist groups. Can you name a few for us, please?
Yeah, there's actually 4 terrorist groups in Africa. There is Al-Qaeda of the Islamic Maghreb, in Maghreb. There's Al-Shabaab, which is also related to Al-Qaeda but operates more in Somalia, Ethiopia and the region around. There's one that is really on the hot topic nowadays, Boko Haram in Nigeria, which is related to ISIS in the Middle East. And finally, there's those really less well-known and smaller groups in Uganda called the Lords of Resistance Army. And the 3 first that I talked about are considered radical Islamic groups, but the Lord of Resistance Army in Uganda are actually Christians. And what we see in Africa is that nowadays terrorism is really linked more to a religious and ideological point of view than a political one, actually, which was not always the case in the history of terrorism.
I think it's very important to note what you brought up, that not all terrorist groups are Islamic. There's also Christian and other religions
and
that are
political ones.
Exactly. And what do you think causes terrorism, especially in Africa?
Especially in Africa, I think it's the overall economic situation. It has been really proven that people who consider themselves as abandoned by society are actually more keen on falling into radicalization. So we could consider a few causes as poverty, lack of opportunities, unemployment, but also like a feeling of exclusion. It doesn't have to be like a real exclusion, but also the feeling of it. And like for example, on the Al-Shabaab history, it has been proven that it's also like resentment against the West, against a foreign occupation. Young people nowadays feel like the West came pretending that they were going to help Africa, but instead they just worsened the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, like Boko Haram specifically means no to the West, which means they're protesting, like you said. They feel like the West came in and they took over instead of coming to help them. So why has terrorism increased like in recent years?
Like as you said, terrorism especially increased from 2009 and over the past 6-7 years, the number of attacks have doubled. It has increased for more than 200%, so it's actually a really big increase. And there's several causes that are still not really clear. But what we are sure of is that globalization and the fact that it's easier to buy weapons, to communicate also online, etc., has really helped, unfortunately, terrorism to take roots in some countries.
Wow, you know, like you said, terrorism is increasing in Africa by 200%. That's a lot, and this is why it's important for Africa to have a permanent seat on the Security Council.
Definitely.
And then we move along, you spoke about online, that people have now access to online and they can contact each other easily. Speaking of being online, I was looking at social media. I always look at social media. I'm sure you've all figured that I always look at social media. And I was looking what's interesting, especially on Twitter. What's the interesting hashtag? And I found one that says hashtag Africa in 60 seconds. It's quite interesting. You get to get tidbits of African history, what's happening in different countries. So I found that quite exciting. So social media, the internet is not only used for terrorism, there's also some informative stuff happening on the internet.
Of course.
Our hashtag of the week is hashtag Africa in 60 seconds. This was started by Curate Kenya, and the purpose of this hashtag was to tell what's going on in your countries, like give the news and scoop of success stories in your countries in 20 seconds. And at Pumeza tweeted hashtag Africa in 60 seconds. South Africa celebrates one of its jewels, Esther Mahlangu 80, who's doing Debele designs for the BMW. And at hashtag Africa in 60 seconds, at Nelan Mwesingwa says who was the first president of Tanzania. So this is basically an information sharing platform.
And speaking of nice things to know about Africa, there's this really interesting initiatives led by Imrana Alaji Buba, which is a young Nigerian student. He's actually only 23.
Wow.
And he created an NGO called YOCAT, which is Youth Coalition Against Terrorism, since we've been speaking about terrorism. And what they do is that they try to enlighten and empower youth in Nigeria especially, so that they don't fall into radicalization. So they visit villages and they explain what is the negative impact of violence, what is security consciousness, and also like how to assist international agencies so that youth actually get really involved into counter-terrorism and counter-radicalization. And they also have skill acquisition trainings and counseling for victims, so they really cover a lot of the terrorism negative impacts, trying to counter it, which is really interesting.
It's a very interesting initiative, and I can see this young man winning a Nobel Peace Prize in years to come. On the topic of Nobel Peace Prizes, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who's a recipient himself, on this day 1989, actually led a march of over 30,000 people in Cape Town against the apartheid government. Looking at terrorism, what we've been talking about, the ANC was actually once considered a terrorist group. This just shows there's no really set parameters or definitions as to what a terrorist group is.
Definitely, and that reminds me, because we've been talking about terror and fear, of a quote from Nelson Mandela, which is quite old today but still really relevant of the modern context, is that he said, "I learned that courage is not the absence of fear but the triumph over it."
I've heard that quote so many times, but every time I hear it, it sounds so profound. And nobody is more profound than Madiba himself. So on that note, I think we should just say goodbye to our viewers. Thank you so much for joining us. Do join us next week. Sare Jaganaka Africa.